Welcome back to God's Story, Our Mission in Week 8, as we explore God's story in the Bible to understand our mission as we are invited to participate in what God is doing in the world. In our lessons so far, we have explored all the ways that God has commissioned us and his people in the Old Testament to be part of what he is doing in the world. We saw how he commissioned Adam and Eve to be his image bearers and how all humanity was designed to be holy temple priests and kings in God's creation. We also saw how he had taken Abram, taken him out of his homeland in Mesopotamia and called him to be the family through whom he would bless the entire world, that through Abraham's offspring he would bring blessing to a cursed world. We also saw in session 3 how God reveals his name, Yahweh, to his people by his mighty acts of redemption and salvation. Indeed, that's what Yahweh is meant to communicate to us, that he is Israel's Goel, the champion for his people, who redeems his people from slavery and bondage. We also saw how he takes this people whom he had redeemed and makes a covenant with them. As we talk about what a relationship with Yahweh looks like, we see the obligations and the parameters and the framework for that relationship on Mount Sinai, that God intends his people, Israel, to be a holy nation and a royal priesthood in order to mediate knowledge of Yahweh to the rest of the world by how they embody a holy way of life. And then most recently, we saw how God included a king in his plan for the world, a king over Israel, a Messiah, to be over his people, to lead them to victory, to take responsibility for worship in the temple, and to embody that covenant relationship. But in all of these lessons that give us an important vision of what God's mission is for the world and how he is going to bring blessing back to a cursed world, as how he is going to communicate knowledge of himself through his people, we see that there is a major detour in all of these areas. That God's people was riddled with failure and sin and brokenness, that indeed Israel was a rebellious and stiff-necked people from the first. Just like how Adam and Eve fell in the garden and was expelled from the garden, so Israel, as a whole people, continued to rebel against Yahweh, breaking his covenant. And therefore, they were also expelled from the land. They were taken into exile. This is a major part of God's story for his people in the Old Testament. In fact, all of the historical books of the Old Testament understand the vantage point of history from the book of Deuteronomy, where at the end of Deuteronomy, God is very clear that for those that are faithful to his covenant, God will bless his people so that they would be holy in the land and share that knowledge of Yahweh for others. But if they persist in unfaithfulness, and if they persist in breaking the covenant, then they would be taken out of the land. Indeed, the land would vomit the people out, as God says in Deuteronomy. Well, even though God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, we see centuries and centuries of God's people being unfaithful, until finally God uses the kingdoms of the Assyrians and ultimately the Babylonians to take God's people out of the land of promise. We read in 2 Kings what this looks like in the 6th century. In 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar rose to power in Babylon and set his sight on the entire ancient Near Eastern world. In 597 BC, he set his sights on Jerusalem. He had taken Jehoiachin, king of Judah, off the throne and set up his uncle Zedekiah as a puppet king in Jerusalem. He took Jehoiachin and many of the elites in Jerusalem into exile in Babylon. We know that there are people like Daniel that are part of this first deportation around 597 BC. But it didn't take long for Zedekiah to rebel against Babylon. Even though he was set up as a puppet ruler, he rebelled, trying to make political alliances with other major powers in the ancient Near East, bringing the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. And therefore, Jerusalem and its temple was destroyed in 587 BC. This began a 70-year exile of many, if not the majority of many of those who lived in Jerusalem, to be led into exile in Babylon, leaving only the poorest of the land back in Judah. That's what 2 Kings tells us. We read that in 2 Kings chapter 25. We read, "So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him, and all his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where the sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of Yahweh, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. We see this devastation of the city of God's own choosing, in the temple which God promised his name would dwell as long as the kings and the people would stay faithful in their covenant relationship. This was the whole apparatus of how God's people understood their relationship to Yahweh. But as we saw last week and the week before, many of the people presumed pridefully and arrogantly upon the presence of Yahweh among the people in the temple and in the city and in the king. They understood God's presence as no more than a talisman, a totem pole, a spell of protection that kept them safe no matter what they did or however they worshiped, however hypocritically or unjustly. But if we remember from the book of Deuteronomy, God did promise curse and exile to those who were unfaithful. But it was still a blow to God's people. In the ancient world, such a catastrophe as this would have been tantamount to saying that Yahweh himself had been defeated by the gods of the Babylonians, by Marduk. And so it caused many of God's people to question if Yahweh was still in charge. Had he been defeated? Had he abandoned his people eternally? This caused quite the crisis of faith. We can ask ourselves, what are those apparatuses for worship? What are those traditions in our own faith life that if they were taken away would cause us to have a crisis of faith? But we hear that this was still God's plan. It was judgment, but God continued to have a plan for his people. Even though God had sent his people into exile, God was not done with his mission. We read in Jeremiah chapter 29 how God had his people think about their time in exile. In Jeremiah, Yahweh tells the prophet to send a letter to those who are in exile, those who had been first deported with Jehoiachin, as they were to understand their time in a foreign land without all the apparatuses to understand their relationship with Yahweh, without the temple, without the city, without the king. And yet Yahweh gives them courage and encouragement to live as God's people even in exile. This is what God has Jeremiah write to the people in exile. This is what Yahweh Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, Yahweh Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares Yahweh. This is what Yahweh says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promises to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares Yahweh, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. I will seek you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares Yahweh, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares Yahweh, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Particularly as we read in the second part of this section, we hear very familiar and very comforting verses that many Christians today use for their own individual lives. When we are in times of uncertainty, we can sometimes cling to these verses in Jeremiah 29, that Yahweh has plans for us, to prosper us and not to harm us. But consider the context in which these verses are actually written. They are for people in exile. They are for people that are not in their homeland or with the traditions and the apparatuses for worship, the framework for which they would understand normally their relationship with God and their identity. And yet Yahweh says that this is for their good, that this is part of God's mysterious plan and purpose and mission for the world. That exile does not mean that Yahweh has abandoned his people, as strange a time as it feels. So he encourages his people to wait patiently, and indeed to plant themselves in their new context, to learn about the people, to pray about the cultures and the leaders in which where they find themselves. Surprising, we might say, that God would have us be part of these foreign cultures, or have his people be part of these foreign cultures. And indeed, one of the great ironies of the Old Testament story is that God had called his people to be holy and different from all the surrounding peoples, so that they would proclaim knowledge of Yahweh among the nations. Israel's failure, in one sense, was that they kept this knowledge to themselves. They hid it under a basket, as it were, as Jesus would say in his Sermon on the Mount. And so, ironically, one of the ways that Yahweh continues to have his mission for the world is by sending his people to other nations in exile. Even in an act of judgment, God does not abandon his people, but he has his mission go forth, that they would be planted in new contexts, so that they would live among other people. And as they continue to learn what their identity with Yahweh truly means as God's people, they can fulfill their vocation and mission in those places. This leads us to ask, what are the contexts in which God has us? Where might we feel like we are in a foreign context and culture, and yet God has us planted? Where are we to develop relationships, maybe uncomfortable relationships? And yet we see that God has plans for us even there. As we turn to another Old Testament book, we see how this works out in practice. That as we are called to live, as God's people are called to live in their vocations, even in exile, we see how God's mission is able to move forward. The book of Daniel is one of those books that highlights how this works out. The book of Daniel, in particular the first 5 chapters, tells the story of 4 exiles, Daniel and his friends, his 3 friends. They are part of that elite class that are brought to Babylon in that first exportation with Jehoiachin in 597. They are those that are brought into the court of Babylon, and we see that those who are in exile weren't necessarily enslaved in exile, but they were given lives with new context in a new culture. They are given jobs, they are given vocations, and they are given education and training. As one Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, says, as we look in the book of Daniel, we see that God's people are called to be bilingual in a cultural sense. They are to know who they are as God's people. They are to know God's will, God's covenant word, but they are also to better understand the culture that is around them. And while we see in Daniel exemplary figures who show us what it means to be bilingual, we also see exemplary characters in Scripture that do not compromise their identity as God's people. And it is this balancing act of not compromising who they are while being bilingual that the mission of God's people in exile is carried forward. We first see in Daniel chapter 1, where Daniel and his 3 friends are brought into exile, and yet they refuse to eat meat and wine. This may seem strange to us. How could eating meat and wine be something that compromises their identity as God's people? And yet in the ancient world, meat was only eaten primarily after a sacrifice to a god. The same with wine, as these were things that were blessed and made as sacrificial offerings to whatever the gods of those people worshipped. Daniel and his friends, by not eating meat or drinking wine, show themselves not to participate in the idolatry of Babylon, even as they participate in their vocations as wise men and stewards of the Babylonian establishment. They recognize that even Yahweh is God over Babylon, even unbeknownst to them. That God is the God of all creation, and so they are able to fulfill their vocations in that establishment with a good conscience, but they are still able to keep themselves from compromising their faith and allegiance to Yahweh alone. So we read in Daniel 1, verses 8 and following, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief officers for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God has caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, 'I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you.' Then Daniel said to the guard whom the chief officers had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal foods, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. We see that this is just a simple example of how Daniel and his friends used wisdom, discernment of how they are to deal in a culture that might not understand their allegiance to Yahweh alone. They didn't fight and argue, but they used discernment. They used wisdom to better tell and communicate their position on the matter. And yet we see that God is faithful to his people even in exile. This, of course, isn't the only time in the book of Daniel that we see Daniel and his friends forced into a position where they are unable to compromise their faith. We also have in Daniel chapter 3 the very famous story of the three friends in the fiery furnace. As King Nebuchadnezzar is prompted to build a grand idol in his kingdom, to command all those who are in his kingdom to bow down and worship the idol at set times during the day. It is Daniel's three friends who show that they will not compromise their faith, to know that they are to worship Yahweh alone. And so King Nebuchadnezzar has them thrown into the fiery furnace. But it is what they say to King Nebuchadnezzar in defense of their faith that is so important. The three friends who are given Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, reply to King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 16 and following of chapter 3. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into blazing furnace. But when we see that God saves them from the fiery furnace, King Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By their lack of compromise, even as they are faithfully being bilingual culturally in Babylon, they are able to communicate something and perform a witness to their God, to our God, the God of the Bible. The book of Daniel has many cases in which we see this faithfulness and exile played out and idealized in Daniel and his three friends. We see that God is able to use us in our cultural vocations, even among people that do not recognize God, as we are called to be excellent in our vocations. Just as Daniel was excellent among all of the magicians of Babylon, though he did not commit any idolatrous practices, he was wiser than all of the Chaldeans because he recognized where true wisdom was found. He was excellent in his vocation, was able to proclaim and witness to the God of heaven, Yahweh, for King Nebuchadnezzar. So we see that through excellence in vocation and through lack of compromise, we have something to offer even in times of perceived exile. But the book of Daniel also has another important message for those who are in exile. It's the message that God will bring his kingdom upon earth as it is in heaven in an ultimate way. As we come to the second half of the book of Daniel, we see the character of the book of Daniel change for those in exile. Again, exile is a time of crisis for God's people. It's a time of waiting, a time of patience, as we are called to plant ourselves and to be patient in our new cultural environment, where we're called to live out our vocations, to pray for our context, to pray for the prosperity and the well-being of those around us. But it's also a time to recognize that God continues to have a plan and a future for his people, where his kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. In Daniel chapter 7, we have what is known as an apocalyptic vision, an unveiling through a very symbolic vision of what God plans for his people. As we look to Daniel chapter 7, we see how this symbolic vision plays out and gives us hope as God's people. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. The visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came out of the sea. The first was like a lion, it had wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, and it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there was before me another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there was before me a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening, and very powerful. It had large iron teeth, and it crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts. It had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and the 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth that spoke beautifully. And as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire. Its wheels were all ablaze. A river of the fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." In the strange vision that is given to Daniel while he is in exile, the point is that God has a plan. The beasts, which in the history of interpretation were attempted to be identified with certain kingdoms in history, although that is a little hard to do sometimes, it at least shows us that among the pagan nations of the world, beastly nations that don't recognize God, there is, in God's plan, a kingdom that will represent God and will be given the full authority of God as the Ancient of Days hands over authority to the one like a son of man. Just as we see in Genesis 1 and 2, it is humanity that is meant to be the full representation of God in his rule for the world. So through his kingdom, through his people Israel, and through the Messiah, all of this is given the final charge over the world, as God has a plan for his people. Even exile won't stop God's plan from moving forward. So what is our mission in exile? As we read in 1 Peter 1, Peter addresses the Christians to whom he is writing as those who are in exile. We, even as New Testament Christians, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the one like a Son of Man who is given full authority over heaven and earth by his resurrection and his crucifixion on the cross, has shown that we still are waiting for that final consummation as God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven, as we look for that day where the new heavens and the new earth are revealed, just as we saw in session 1 of our Bible study. We know where we are headed. We know that final vision, and it is all happening in Jesus, who is given the full authority even in his incarnation as he has as the eternal Son, the Ancient of Days, with the Father. Yet we know that until that final day, we are living in an exile, just like God's people. We are called to wait patiently. We are called by our faithful patience to witness to who God and what his kingdom truly is in the world. And yet we are now called to be bilingual. We are called to be bilingual in our culture as we build bridges as that priestly nation. We might not have our own nation as Christians, but we don't need to, because we are the temple, as we learned last time. We are the temple of God built upon the foundation of Jesus, and so we bring that worship and that witness wherever we are, even in exile. We are called to live out our vocations in an excellent way, fulfilling the excellencies of how God had created us in mind, body, and spirit, all for the sake of witnessing to our neighbors who Yahweh is and what he has done through his Son, Jesus. In all of these ways, we see that even in times of exile, God's mission for his people carries forward. We don't have to stop. We don't have to have a crisis of faith just because it's hard for us to see how God's plan is moving forward. God is faithful to his promises, and we see that faithfulness ultimately in Jesus. He is that apocalyptic vision. As Paul says in Romans, Jesus is the apocalypse, the unveiling of God's plan for the world. And so we gather around him even in our times of exile. But this takes wisdom. That's why next time we are going to be looking at the book of Proverbs as God shapes us to be bilingual people, as it were, to build bridges culturally with wisdom, just like Daniel and his friends, who knew how to use the wisdom given to them from God to make bridges for the sake of witnessing to Yahweh. So we will also learn to listen to wisdom and to be shaped as wise people for God's mission. That's for next time. God bless.